just to settle us all in, I'm going to throw a googly at you, if that's okay. So the theme of this festival is Here Comes the Sun. And all of us, all over the world, have had a tempestuous, troubled few years. And I hope we're coming out of it now. Yeah. So when you think about Here Comes the Sun, what does that mean to you?
Well, God, it means the Emirates as usual, I think. No? Yeah, it's probably the right time for that kind of approach. But Dubai has always been about being optimistic and facing challenges with not just a realistic view of where things are going, but also seeing things as an opportunity. And I think Dubai, in particular Dubai, has done an amazing job in both handling COVID and handling the opportunities. So yeah, the sun, optimism, perfect.
What a brilliant thing to hear, those, you know, business as usual, and let's keep going forward. Because going forward is really all we can do, isn't it?
It's not actually just business as usual. Dubai opened up in a certain way which attracted people from all over the world who wanted to continue working and were ready to take certain risks with their own health. And also who wanted to be able to say, look, you know, I'm as an adult, and I can handle this risk myself. So given the freedom to take that risk, Dubai was ready to offer that opportunity. And in opening up, so many people who would never have stepped foot in Dubai or thought of it as a place to do business have now actually moved to Dubai. That is already adding to the richness and the complexity of the business environment, but also the cultural environment. Because as you know, so much now is conceptual, it's intelligence-oriented, it's design-oriented. So it's great.
I'm glad you said that, actually, the cultural environment. And of course, we have the amazing expo here, which was meant to be in 2020, and now wonderfully it's here 2021 into 2022. Yeah. Culture, and so you are Assistant Minister for Culture, and I know from reading Letters to a Young Muslim, you have a wonderful preoccupation with language and ideas, imagination. How do you lean into that within your role?
Well, my interest in language is only because I don't speak them very well, and so that's why I've set myself this target, which is now impossible to reach. But in my role in terms of culture, the way I look at it is I'm much more excited by the idea of culture as evolving mentalities, a melding of different civilizations, different approaches here in the Emirates. And I think that kind of links up with the spirit of Expo, but it also links up with the new kind of statements that our government and leaders have been making about the Emirates not being simply a community of Emiratis and foreigners, but being an Emirati community where everybody is welcome. And often you'll hear that we have 200 nationalities living here and peace and stability. Yeah, that's true, but they're also interacting with each other. And sort of new forms of thought are, as far as I can see, are developing. And I also say that, the melding of cultures is taking place as well at the level of, sort of Emiratis marrying foreigners. I'm the product of one of those marriages. I spoke to an Emirati girl earlier this evening, who is also the product of a mixed marriage. And there are so many Emiratis who are now of mixed origin that it will only enrich us and enrich our culture even more. So my approach is to, rather than to look to the past and to kind of put our culture in boxes and put them into, sort of, to basically reify them. I mean, once you've done that, the culture is over. So I'm much more interested in where our culture is today and where it's evolving and the different routes that it can take. It's not entirely straightforward, and it involves learning what young people are doing.
Absolutely. You're talking there very much about fusion. You said blended and used the word melded. Yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking about your own particular background, but also sort of your recent professional history as well. You've spent time in France and time in Russia, and do you think being in those very different societies and exposed to a very different culture has sort of influenced how you are going forward?
Yes, absolutely. The way you spend the day, your day defines you. Who you speak to defines you. Your thoughts define you, and you can start off being authentically Arab and Muslim. But your thoughts will take you into a completely different zone. And it's something that I mentioned in my book, Letters to a Young Muslim, that we're all human, we're all born with the same set of issues to deal with, whether kind of physical, social, or existential, whether we like it or not. These questions arise in societies everywhere in the world. Many societies have attempted to create answers to those questions. And I was suggested that it would be important for a young Muslim not only to look at Islamic theology to understand the modern world and the way in which religion interacts, or faith interacts with the modern world, but to look also at the theologies of other religions as well. So you've got your Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism, all of the different kind of branches. And you realize that actually there are so many verbal arguments, verbal descriptions of situations that are hugely satisfying to read, even though they don't come specifically in your language or in a direct line coming out of sort of traditional Islamic scholars. So that, again, melding ideas, because we all live similar lives, melding ideas, I think, is really important.
I thought what you said at the top of that, who we talk to, how we spend our days, defines who we are. I suppose that's about experience. Were you very aware of that in terms of your desire to talk to your son in a way that he couldn't answer back? It was in book form, in the written word form, so that you could help him or instruct him to begin to think as you've just described there?
I'm actually increasingly inclined to realize that it was really letters to myself, me trying to figure out my own position in the world, going back to when I was a 15-year-old. My older son is, just like my younger son, they're both very well, they're much better equipped to deal with the world than I was at their age, perhaps because they have, a stable family around them. And I don't impose any obligations on them to listen to me. I'll occasionally sort of throw out a bit of advice and say, just double check, did you hear that advice? And they'll say, yeah, I heard it. And does it mean anything to you? Not really. I'm like, okay, well, I'll try again tomorrow. Yeah? But they have their own lives and they have their own kind of resilience. And I think that's also something that we need to recognize. Not everybody is fragile. Some people are simply resilient and they just get on with things.
Yeah. They do have their own lives, as hard as that is for us as parents to bear. So you've got Letters to a Young Muslim, and sort of sitting there, sort of invisibly, is book 2. We haven't got book 2 in front of us, but it's very much in your mind and in mine here. What I do know about book 2, I feel that the two books, and I said this to you earlier, it feels like they're non-identical twins, or different sides of the same coin. Was that, again, just a conscious, or it just came from you, that's what you had to do next?
Actually, that book came first. I actually started writing the first passages when I was 25. I'm not much older than that now, but...
oh, yeah.
We were also speaking about age earlier on. So I started writing it when I was 25, and I realized that it was... I didn't know quite what it was, and it's only in the last couple of years that I began to realize that what I was trying to do was I was trying to identify so much with my father that I was finding myself trying to trying to understand what happened to him on his last day, having pieced together bits and pieces. And then I thought to myself, clearly I want to identify so much with those last few moments. Let me actually imagine that I was there and that I'm speaking from his perspective. So the novel is my father's last day told in the first person. So he narrates. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He narrates, from the moment he wakes up, 6 a.m., and as he goes through his day, and I remember, I've kind of done research on this. I know the route that he took, where he went, a couple of things that he said to my mother, and so on, and then the route all the way to the scene of his death. And so, for me to be able to piece together a kind of a narrative of what he did. Provided me a tremendous satisfaction. I mean, I even drew a map of the route that he took from home to the office, then from the office to a hotel, from the hotel, because the meeting was delayed, he went somewhere else for an hour, there was a conversation that took place, then he came back. And all of these things allowed me to kind of get into at a granular level into his day. And all of these places still exist. I mean, they're right there in Abu Dhabi. Yeah? And so I can actually follow that route even today. So for me, it was very, very satisfying. And then I started thinking, well, I've always been fascinated by what he had done in his life. So he was 43 when he died. And from my perspective, that's particularly young, right? As a child, I used to think, he was an old man. But now I look back and I think he was a young man. Mm. He'd only just started in life. And he had plans and he had ambitions. And so what he does during the day is that he'll observe the world around him. He's got an hour to kill between a meeting and another meeting. And so he'll kind of reminisce about his childhood. Or he'll think about how he has reached this particular stage. I think this is in 1977. In 1972, Ras Al Khaimah became part of the Emirates. So prior to that, he was a citizen of Ras Al Khaimah as opposed to a citizen of the Emirates. And it's just, for me, it's intriguing to think that he was pretty much penniless when he came back to the Emirates in 1969. And for him to have, done all of these things very, very quickly, moving up the ladder of the civil service, being one of the founders of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where I work as well today, it kind of makes me think that I know the kinds of issues that he would have faced in the ministry itself, right? There are some people in the ministry who were in the ministry in 1977 as well, who worked alongside my father. So there's a lot of material that I can work on there. But it also allows him to reflect on where the Emirates was and where it ended up in 1977. However, the novel doesn't actually end there. So he continues after his passing to comment on what happens next. And it's that for me became, there's a certain amount of black comedy involved as well. Because now he's passed into the next life and he's observing all kinds of interesting human behavior. People running, but also trying to claim credit for having tried to save him. And these are facts. I find it absolutely fascinating. Just to see that, so I think public relations, communications, Instagram, all of these things are very much 2021, 22. But it turns out in the 1970s, even in a situation of tragedy, people were really quick thinking about who's going to benefit out of the situation, whose career will go forward, who's going to be labeled a hero. And I'm like, wow, It's kind of a comment on human nature, how there is a certain sense of mourning, but it doesn't last very long. And life goes on. And so sorry if I keep going.
It's fascinating.
So as a child, I used to look through the newspapers covering my father's death. The first day, then the second day, then the third day, then the fourth day. By the fourth day, we're talking about in the newspapers, they'd covered that story. It was now pretty much over. And I started looking through the classifieds, and there was just hilarious classifieds. Somebody in particular wanted to buy a motorcycle, but in advertising for a motorcycle, he said, and can the person who sells me the motorcycle also teach me how to drive it, or to ride it? I'm like, this is amazing. My family is going through this awful trauma, and people are, there's one particular advert which is fantastic. This guy was raising money for investments where you'd make 20% a month. Like, this is superb. 1977, life continues. So yeah, the sun shines. Yeah?
Life continues, but it is so interesting, isn't it, that there are all these multiple channels happening at the same time, and sometimes they cross and sometimes they don't. Yeah. Interesting, though, that we're talking about it all these years later, and it is running through your veins. You can feel the energy as you talk. You were 6 when this happened to you and your family, and they do say that between 0 and 6, the things that happen in that time really impact and have imprint upon us. So it's interesting that that is still within you. And I was very aware in reading Letters to a Young Muslim of that ongoing search that you have. You've mentioned the newspapers. And your desire to find out, or separate fact from fiction, I suppose. What did that feel like emotionally? Do you feel distant enough from it to be able to be quite, objective about it, or does it bring up things that need to be examined a little bit more?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. So it has been 44 years, and guess what? These things don't go away.
No.
And that is just a fact of my life. Writing letters to a young Muslim was very useful in removing some of the anxiety around it, although indirectly. But I referred to a key problem about my father's life, which is that my family and I are unable to put the facts in the right place. And that doesn't allow you to let go. And also, I thought to myself, it would be a disservice to my father not to piece together what he did in his life, what he was planning to do, and his last day. And I think it also it's a comment on maybe our culture here in the Emirates or in the Arab world or in the Muslim world, this desire to just put trauma behind you very quickly, to say, it's over, God's will, 3 days of mourning, let's move on. And I think for the people who say that, if they're not directly affected by it, it's actually really easy. I'll happily say to somebody who's, lost somebody, well, I'm really, really sorry, yeah? And then, head off to get a coffee. However, that person then spends a huge amount of time working through that situation. And but I see this kind of desire to forget the past in other places as well. Perhaps, the Arab world is always trying to move forward. And there's almost a desire to say, look, let's just forget what happened. We start a new page today, we move on. But it kind of links in with this issue of knowing the past in order to move forward, right? We continue in our part of the world to say that the past doesn't matter because it's all ugly, it's all, that there's no value in kind of thinking about it. And actually what we need to do is focus on now and the future, because we're going to build a glorious future. I don't know, I worry that if you're not looking at the past, if you're not retrieving elements of the past and rethinking them, then it's very difficult to build a future.
Yeah, I mean, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, and all of that.
Yeah.
I thought what you said there about your family doesn't know in what order, and if you don't know the order of an event that's been particularly traumatic, it makes it difficult to grieve, I think.
Yeah.
So is this part of your ability to put yourself through the natural stages of grief, if there is such a thing?
Okay, so I put it slightly differently. There's possibly a lot of truth in what you've just said. I prefer to say that this novel is my final goodbye. And in a way, I'd be able to say, okay, well, I've done what I, as a son, I perhaps owed my father. I've done something, I offered up kind of a work of art in his honor. And so in a way to immortalize him, at least for me, and then to move on and do other things. So in that sense, yeah, maybe.
That's really moving to hear, and I'm sure we can all identify with that. Being able to bring something to a closure, is there such a thing? I don't know, but to our own sort of sense of finality about something and moving on. You're a father and a son, a brother, a nephew, a cousin, I imagine. Yeah. But let's just focus on those first two.
You've just made me think of all of my complicated relationships.
Your husband.
Oh, gosh.
But we won't talk about that. So just dwelling on being a father, because your father left you when you were 6 years old.
Yeah.
So there was no role model for you. There was your mother.
Yes.
Who was an amazing role model, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So what sort of father are you? If you were to talk about yourself, how would your sons describe you? What sort of dad are you?
Okay, so the first thing that you should know is, because I grew up without a father, I had no concept of boundaries. And so I lavished my sons with boundaryless love, which is actually no good in bringing up a child. I didn't realize that, I've had to spend quite a bit of time studying parenthood in order to understand that children need the security of boundaries. They need to know that, okay, beyond this, I can't go. And if I do, then I've somehow infringed the family kind of law. And I've always been like, no. Just thinking in terms of boundaries was something that had never occurred to me. I always thought in terms of, well, child probably knows right from wrong, good from bad, what is in their interest and what isn't. And it's not that straightforward. They don't always know. And quite often what they're engaged in is not a kind of a conversation with themselves, but they're engaged in a battle with you to get as much out of you as possible, whether it's objects or money or leeway or permission to go and do things. And they're expecting, almost instinctively, some pushback. And as a father, I never gave that pushback. And so it's been a very interesting period.
You said that you had no role model because your father, he died when you were 6 years old. And so being a parent yourself was more complex. And as you've just mentioned, you didn't set the boundaries. But actually, you didn't know how to be a son either, I guess.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So when you see your sons and how they are...
Well, my mother's a wonderful woman, but she had 3 sons and a daughter. And I don't know what it was in me, but I was a very aggressive, angry, violent child. I'm no longer. But I was, and I didn't know why. Somebody, a few years ago, somebody said to me, I got angry in front of them. I think it was the first time in 10 years that I spoke to them with anger in my voice. And this person, whom I respect very much, said, you have to deal with your anger. My response was, well, look, I've only lost my temper once in front of you. Only later did I realize that he understood that there was a posture of anger towards the world within me. And again, that's part of why this book is really important to me. That's also why the new book is very important to me. But it's also why I've discovered within the resources of our own kind of environment here in the Emirates and the Islamic world that you can approach your own texts and your own faith with a posture of, I don't want to say peace because that's been overused in connection with Islam, but a kind of quiet.
Yeah, and that is true. But also when something traumatic happens, it hits us in the body. The body absorbs trauma, and unless it's released, and usually through a release of anger or inhabiting an anger, then it stays and explodes out in all sorts of different ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if you think also about the amount of trauma that is being imposed in Arab and Muslim societies by Arabs and Muslims on each other, and you think that these little bits of knowledge that trauma is contained in the body, feeling and emotion are contained in the body, and that there are ways in which you can work through them and remove them from your life, and you think that so many people have no access to that kind of guidance and knowledge. Well, I mean, if you're business oriented, there's a huge business out there for you, waiting.
Absolutely, there is, for sure. The teaching of compassion and empathy, understanding.
But it has to be deeper than that. There's a reason for compassion. I mean, quite often we talk about compassion and empathy only because, well, virtue signaling. I must be compassionate. I'm a friendly person. I like people. But if you aren't delving deep into either your own trauma or other people's trauma, how real is that?
How we understand each other, how we're prepared to understand each other, what the story we read, we all read just by looking at each other is quite complex. That's a whole other book to be written, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, there's another kind of aspect here that I'm a bit hesitant about. A couple of people spoke to me from the family and said, maybe you shouldn't be so public about displaying this kind of emotion. And I think, okay, you've got a point, but maybe you're of a different generation. And I've received so much positive feedback from young Arabs and young Emiratis who've said that my book has helped them tremendously. And that great kind of satisfaction for me. It provides a reason to continue writing. But this new book, it's going to be different. It's about partly it's about how short life is. And some of the things that my father will do in the book will be, should I have made that kind of choice? Because these are choices of how you approach the world. And one of the key choices that I believe my father made was to be a man of justice rather than to be a man of politics. And being a man of justice means you stand by your principles, you stand by your values, you actually have them. And that's partly why what happened to him, I believe. Whereas there are people around him who are men of politics, and politics is much more personal, and it's also very much about survival. And as a man of justice, you will not be on your guard, but as a man of politics, you're always on your guard. And that's a kind of key choice that everybody makes, I think. Even in the smallest of government departments or companies or institutions, you're making a choice. Do I play the political game in the office, or do I, have a higher ideal? And so he explores that.
Oh, the higher ideal. So tell us more about that.
Higher ideal. Well, I'm still going through a final draft, and so there are different directions I'm going to take. I'm still considering. There are certain passages that I wrote that came out very angry, and there are certain passages that came out almost resigned, and other passages that came out with a lot of black humor, sarcasm, cynicism, and I need to find the right way of melding all of these together, because all of that is actually part of a person's life. But what is the final kind of summation of a person's life? Do you leave it going in these different directions, or do you try to provide, essentially, to close the book, there needs to be some way of saying, what happened, happened. Yeah? But if it's to be of any value to people who are reading it, perhaps it's in thinking about the choices that you make. And again, the structural choices, justice versus politics, power and money versus true aspiration, fulfillment. And I suspect that he's going to say, I wish I'd focused on myself rather than trying to contribute to a society that's going in a certain direction anyway. And I think we talked about this just before we came on, the idea of fighting culture. Can you fight culture? A lot of Emiratis in particular will come back from abroad and they'll have all these ideas, and then they come crashing up against the local bureaucracy, the families. You've got, again, I think I mentioned this, aib or haram. So aib means, it's not done socially, socially not accepted, and haram means it goes against your religion. So these are two huge areas that prevent us from going off and being creative or daring or challenging. And, just questions.
So many questions. We could talk for a lot longer, but I just want to ask you one more thing before we open it to the floor. So we all have markers in our life, and there are either moments that usually marked by big occasions, birthdays, celebrations, etc., dates. So you had 6, your boys and your girls will be 6. You had 19, the age of the person who took your father's life, and 43.
Yeah.
Your past, 43.
Yes.
I'm sure that must feel very relieving. But your father was 43, and I was really struck by his youth, actually, in the book, as you described him. But also something that your mum said. Can you tell us that, just before I open? She said on his final day something about him.
Yeah. So we had it was a 2-story or a 3-story, I don't know how to describe it, but he was standing at the top of the stairs and she was at the bottom of the stairs, and she looked up at him, and she just said that he was glowing with a kind of a halo. And that's a very beautiful thing to say. And it could have been imagined later, but it always stuck with me in my mind that that's her last image of him before he went off to work that day. Yeah,
I think we all do need to have those things to, that help us. It's something to hold, isn't it, as we walk through the next stages of our lives. Yeah. And in many ways, this book and the book that we are yet to enjoy is what you're doing for yourself, which is tremendous. And we really look forward to it being published and to read it.
Your Excellency, you've talked a lot about how you've struggled in language, especially in Arabic. And you as an Emirati and a public official, do you feel the sense and loss of identity as an Emirati?
No, I don't actually. I actually think that if you say that being an Emirati means you have to speak in a certain way, look a certain way, dress a certain way, and have a camel and a stick, and no, really, because this is something that people like me have faced for a long time. I remember in the early 2000s, a very senior figure in Dubai, in fact, had a Ramadan majlis, and he denounced very, very aggressively the foreign wives and their children because they were clearly going to be immoral. I actually saw him a few days later, and I said, "Thank you very much for your statement." And he looked at me and he said, "No, no, no, I didn't mean people like you. You're different." And I'm like, "How am I different? You've just gone and labeled all people like me as immoral." I had a conversation again, and that was almost 20 years ago. I had a conversation today with a young Emirati, and he was talking about how he was, spending a bit of time with some foreigners. And then he also said, but of course, they have no meaning in their life because they don't have aib and haram. We have aib and haram, so we have meaning. I was like, buddy, where did that come from? So no, if our identity is going to be defined in those terms, I don't have any problems losing it. I am Emirati, I'm a human being. My father made choices, just as your parents have all made choices. I'm not going to be blamed for not coming out precisely the way somebody defines for me. It's very easy to say, look, I have pure blood, I have the right language, I dress the right way, and you're different, therefore you are not worthy enough and you don't have an identity. I think the Emirates is beyond that. And I think in terms of leadership, leadership is already very, very clearly stated. We're an Emirati community. This is my message to young Emiratis. If you think in the way that perhaps we did 30 years ago, and I have privileges, I have rights, I have this, I have that, you're not in the Emirates today, because the Emirates today is now part of a global economy, and we are inviting the top of the world, the best and the brightest in the world, with money, without money, and we are giving them visas, and we are giving them nationality. And then what will you say to them? You'll say you don't have the right identity? He's going to be employing you. Yeah? But good question.
Very, very good question indeed.
Thank you.
And I would just like to follow on from that question, actually. So you mentioned people sort of marrying interculturally now, and in fact, that's what your father and mother did, and then your father died when you were 6. And did you struggle to have a sense of identity because suddenly the Arabic language wasn't in your household,
Sure.
and you were living here in Dubai?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, identity was the biggest question for me. But I realized that I think I mentioned it in the book also, that seeking an identity, seeking to become something defined by somebody else for their own particular reasons, I've just disadvantaged myself from the second. It's a pointless task. I can never be pure blood, yeah, but I can be me, and I can do me really well. Yeah?
Yeah, that's a massive lesson for an ongoing lesson of life, I think.
Hi there, Father.
Hi.
We've met.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you've had got to choose my words carefully, a fairly aggressive childhood, and as you matured, there must have been a turning point. Pretty much many people in the room probably, we've all had a turning point, whether it's getting married, moving to a new country, finding a job. Would you be able to trace back that turning point for you, which actually helped you get to the other side of that perspective?
Turning points, really interesting question.
There were a couple of turning points, happened roughly at the same time. So, there's like a piling on of turning points. One was at the beginning of an exam, one of my, it's not a friend, it was just a kid in class who said something about my mother. The usual Arabic phrase that young men say to each other. And we did a 2-hour exam, and I came out at the end of the exam, and I hurt him. And he had to leave school in an ambulance. Yeah, you know that I apologized to him for the next 25 years? I was 12 and I thought I'd done something awful, and I had done something awful. I'd let my temper take me to a place that I was no longer aware of what I was doing. You know, after the 5th year of me apologizing, he began to think I had issues. Yeah, he's a good guy, he's doing well. But that was definitely a turning point. That was where I thought, okay, there's something happening here that I'm not really clear on. But then there was another turning point. We used to have weekly rankings, because I used to go to Shweifat, if anybody knows that brilliant school. So weekly rankings, and I think I was 128th out of 128 students. And I would turn up to these exams and I would ask my friends, number one, what exam do we have today? Because I had no clue. And then number two, can I borrow a pen? And I'm like, you know, of course they've been studying all weekend. And after one particular exam, I think I got 3 out of 20. And there was an Egyptian kid who was crying because he got 18 out of 20, and I laughed at him. I was like, huh, you know. And he looked at me and he said, you're just an idiot. So yeah. So that night I went back home and I thought, you know what, he has a point. So I started studying, and then it became obsessive. And I was always in the top 5. I mean, it took time to move my average up, but I think by the end of like 6 months I was in the top 5. And I had all the anxiety of a nerd. Yeah. It's awful. I was probably better off not studying, to be honest.
I was identifying with that story in a way. Many years ago, I did piano lessons, and I was very bad at piano, so the piano teacher said, you can sing in this competition instead. And there were 13 people in the competition, and I sang, and I came 12th. And I went home, and my grandmother said, how did you get on? And I said, I came 12th out of 13. And I was so excited and happy, but unfortunately, I didn't then become obsessive about singing and become some pop star at all.
I have to tell you a story which is related and is beautiful. A friend of mine, about 20 years ago, was working in the municipality in Dubai, and the municipality would send people abroad to do these courses. So 2 of his colleagues went off on a course to Cyprus, and they came back. And they asked the organizers, the committee within the municipality, for an extra bonus because they came first and second in this course. And so my friend is sitting in the committee, and he said, I have one question. How many other people were there? It was just 2. Yeah,
yeah,
so
detail. It's
I
in the
love
detail.
it. I love it. And I asked him, how are they doing today? He said, they're both billionaires. Yeah.
Yeah. Another question?
So, Omar, I want to ask, did you ever turn to books to find yourself or help you when you were in difficult times? And if you did, what were they and how did they help?
Very good. Thank you, Isabel.
You know, when I was 11, my closest friends went to boarding school. And I felt like I was falling behind them. Every time I'd see them, they'd seem so sophisticated. And I'd always ask them, well, what are you studying? And we had a funny thing when I was a kid, is that in Shweifat, doing 5 O-levels or GCSEs was seen as something really advanced. And all of my friends who were in England were doing 10. So I thought, wait a second, something's not working here. And so I started trying to catch up with them. And I'd always ask my friends, what are they reading? Because they turn up with these books with really small letters. Actually, it all turned out to be Wilbur Smith. You know, Men of Men, and the Ballantines, and it was just wonderful. So I just charged through these books, and it was just a desire for adventure. And then after a while, after I'd finished a ton of those books, my mother started throwing Russian literature at me, which bleak, dark, miserable, existentialist stuff. So I don't recommend it to adolescents. I don't recommend it to teenagers at all.
Yeah, very dark humor.
No humor.
Yeah.
So yes, I find sometimes I'll pick up. I will try to read novelists that are meant to be sort of great, and I actually sometimes think I haven't got a clue why this is of any interest. But then I'll come across another writer, and all of a sudden every little statement kind of clicks with a feeling I had, but I never knew how to describe, or I didn't have a name for it. And so I'm always on the search for new writing that will allow me to maneuver myself within myself. I'm glad that you said that, actually, because we are always searching, aren't we? We're searching within ourselves and trying to find a guide to take us forward. I'm just curious, on the back of that last question there, in the writing of both books,
did you feel, what instruction did you get from it that you didn't understand would be there when you began writing the books? It just, afterwards, you thought, gosh, I learned that.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. It really did happen. I mean, this new book, there were times when I write intensely. So I remember there was a time when I was writing 4,000 words a day. And it was just following every single detail, all of a sudden making connections that never occurred to me before. And also because, I had bits and pieces of knowledge of what happened. I'd spoken to different people. And as you write, you discover that these things begin to click together in different ways. It's kind of a mosaic, but it's not just a flat, it's a multi-dimensional mosaic. And it's just really, really strange to be able to do. So yeah, the writing process itself pulls things out of you that you didn't know were there, which is great. It's fun.
Having had those things pulled out of you, if there was to be a third book, would you be sort of going completely down a different route, or would you be sticking to that sort of family investigation and exploration and sense of self-exploration?
Honestly, I needed to write Letters to a Young Muslim, and I need to write this book. At the moment, I don't discern any need to write anything else, to be honest. But I'll call you if I do.
Yeah, watch this space. That's exciting.
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I'm glad to have the chance to briefly talk to you before the session. Actually, I have a question about for Muslims living overseas in non-Muslim country. What advice would you give to them to be more integrated and to be more welcome to the community? And what images we should deliver to the community in non-Muslim countries? Thank you.
I don't think of countries as Muslim and non-Muslim to begin with. I don't think we need to present an image. I think we need to genuinely be who you are. But earlier we spoke, and you mentioned to me that you'd been exposed to some teachings that are Islamic, but offend you, your humanity. So that in itself is a really important kind of compass. People will present certain things as fact when it's not fact. It's their perspective, and they're committed to that perspective for, I don't know, reasons of ignorance, financial, institutional, all kinds of reasons. If I were you, I'd be aware of who is trying to guide you, especially in a world where we have access to so many different sources of information. There's no specific reason why we should take one person or one group as the guide, which it makes life much more difficult, but also because, I mean, we're in a Muslim country here, and I can see lots of people here who don't look like they're Muslim. They're not the traditional. They may be, but you can't walk around assuming that everybody is on the same wavelength as you. We're in a mixed culture. All cultures now are mixed. Everywhere you go, you're going to come across people who have nothing to do with the original inhabitants or the original kind of structures of thought. So maybe just a bit of humility, a bit of generosity, and walk away from problems.
One of the most powerful things for me in Letters to a Young Muslim was the balance and the fairness of voice as you were talking to your boy, and the love of trying to cradle him so that he leads ongoing a balanced life, so he can see through a wider lens than anything, as wide a lens as possible. Another thing that struck me thinking about that was that the difference generationally, I mean, you weren't an old dad when you had him, you were fairly young, but the vast difference between you then and him your age when you had him, and also the vast difference between your father and you as well. So just thinking about all that rapid change that happens in society, especially with technology as it is, thinking about the grandchildren you may have. What would you hope for them?
Well, I have 2 young daughters now who are just under 4, so they are almost my grandchildren, right? Well, I'm going to be, well, when they are 20, I'll be 70, or just over 70, right?
Do you feel that?
Do I feel that?
Yes.
Well,
does
no,
that,
I
does
don't
that make you feel like an
I'm,
old father?
Well, I don't feel like I'm 70 today. But yeah, I do think it'll be funny. It'll be odd. Yeah. Well, I don't regret having them. They're wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it's not like we have much choice about this.
No.
Technology moves at such an amazing pace. Yeah.
But thinking about what you're telling your son and trying to tell your son, do you think in 20 years' time your son will be saying the same things to his children?
Good question. I actually don't know. I mean, if he does, that will simply mean my book is a classic. And if he doesn't, well, then, you know, it'll be an antique, yeah? You know,
win-win.
A rare item, yeah?
I'm sorry I haven't read your book, but I will literally just step out and buy it. But I
Thank you very much.
The content extremely interesting. And my question is kind of like related again to identity, which we've tackled and you've tackled a lot during the talk. And this concept of maybe hybrid identity that Amin Maalouf explores in his essay on identity. I think it's quite interesting. I myself, I'm half Mexican, half Egyptian, so I've been questioned many times, like which half has more weight than the other. No clear question about that. But the question is more related to the title of the book and why you chose a young Muslim as opposed to a young Ghobash or a young Arab or a young Emirati. Do you give more weight to that part of the identity of your child, or maybe later to a young boy or a young man?
Yeah.
I don't know if there was a specific choice at the time of choosing the title, maybe trying to reach out to a wider audience, or why was that choice?
Actually, I said to myself when I wrote the book and it was going to be published that I'd be happy with if 1,000 people bought the book. It was more about making a statement and making a statement that was public, because I think it's too easy to make statements over dinner with friends and then forget about it during the day. I wanted to be held accountable for my words by a community. Now, why young Muslim? Because I tussled with my faith for one simple reason. Everyone I came into contact with would not entertain questions about it. The answer would be, no, you don't ask questions, this is what it is, just do this, do that. When I was 14 or 12, I had a very simple question. You know, as you're praying, and I used to do the Taraweeh prayer as a child, so you know, it's like 20 it can be an hour-long prayer at the end of the day of Ramadan. And I used to say, so what do I think about while I'm praying? And nobody could answer that question. And it's actually only now, at this age, that I begin to think, well, maybe there is, within prayer, within worship, there's a whole space in which you can actually explore what it is that you're doing. Yeah? So at that time, all I had to do was repeat the words. There are certain set phrases, just repeat them. And that's it, you've done it. But that is such an empty form of prayer. And that's just one example of many, many different questions that I had that nobody could answer. And then ISIS turned up on the scene. And so this was written, finally I wanted to write it as a rejection of that mentality. The mentality of not asking questions and being told what to do. And that's why I made it Letters to a Young Muslim, because it's an extremely attractive proposition. You know, you're given this very basic formula, follow it, and it's intense. There's tons of adrenaline, and if you're a young man, you get your women, you get your guns, you get to steal things, but it's okay because you're doing it in the name of God, and you can really become a god in your own right. So I wanted to say, actually, I now understand what I think faith is, and what religion is, and what Islam is, and it's not that. Now, and that's why this is Letters to a Young Muslim, not to a young Emirati or Anybody else?
Yeah, it was respect, out of respect for it as well.
Yeah.
Paying homage to it. The question started by asking about the title. So I think we need to round this off by this unpublished book that we've been talking about for an hour. What is it going to be called?
I have to say, I'm really impressed with myself that I can talk about an unpublished book. It's, yeah. Imagine what happens when it comes out, right?
Yeah. You'll be here again next year.
You know, the working title I have is 2510, which is the 25th of October, when my father died.
2510.
Yeah.
Well,
because it repeats every year, 2510.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, you know?
Yeah, good title, good title. Okay, we're going to draw this to a close, and before I officially do, I have got to say some thank yous. So without further ado, thank you very much to the room crew who are all around, and you know, they are so important to the festival, the people who staff these rooms. So thank you very much, all of you, indeed.
Can I say, they're also all wearing black, so you can't see them.
Yeah, you can't see them, but they're all around. And to our translators, this has been translated, obviously, which we are very grateful for, and everybody who makes it possible for it to reach other audiences wherever they are. The AV team, really important these days. The title sponsor, Emirates Airline, our partner, Dubai Culture, and our session sponsors, DMI Radio and TV sector, and finally, Dubai Tourism. I would also like to thank all of you for coming along, for asking such amazingly interesting questions, and that prompted such brilliantly thought-provoking answers as well. Thank you very much indeed. This is the first evening occasion of the 14th Emirates Airline Festival of Literature. It's such a delight, can't tell you, to be here. Most of all, thank you to Omar Saif Ghobash. Thank you.
Thank you.